Welcome to the Sandwich Generation Survival Guide. I am your host, Candace Dellacona, and I am so happy to have our guest join us today, Dr. Ashwini Bapat from EpioneMD. I am really excited to have Ashwini here today to talk to you all of our listeners, about Ashwini's background and this sort of revolutionary approach she has taken with families who are dealing with loved ones who perhaps are towards the end of their life. So welcome, Ashwini.
Thank you so much for having me here, Candace.
My pleasure. So for our listeners, I want everyone to know how qualified you are. So you are a Tufts trained physician. You did your residency at Yale, your fellowship at Yale. You are a hospice and palliative care physician. You have instructed at Yale and Mass General and Harvard. So I would say, in a nutshell, you are qualified to talk about this topic. So we are thrilled to have you.
I'm very excited to be here, and I'm excited to have this important conversation, I think.
Absolutely. So, why don't you tell us, just from the start, as someone who has gone through such rigorous training as a physician, all of our listeners know the intense coursework and the hours that you have to put in to become a physician here in the United States. What made you take sort of a different path than a hospitalist or something similar?
Sure. So I worked as a primary care doctor for a little bit. I worked as a palliative care physician for a pretty long time. I've worked in hospice. And the thing is that as a palliative care doc, I've had thousands of conversations with other people's parents, other people's families about how they want to be taken care of now as they live with, let's say, dementia, or as they live with cancer. And the thing is that my own dad was diagnosed with dementia a couple of years ago. And around that time, I realized that having seen so many people live with dementia, I knew that there was this window of time, a window of opportunity where I could have a conversation with him about what he wants now, how he wants to live now. And when I started looking at resources in terms of how I can have that conversation with him, like what do we need to talk about, I realized that there just wasn't a ton around how do you actually live with an illness like dementia. And there was a lot around end-of-life wishes and wishes around dying and death and things like that. But there wasn't a ton around how do you actually live with an illness. And so that was kind of the moment that sparked this idea to say, are there ways to create resources to help myself and to help other people have these conversations with their loved ones, with their parents, around how they want to live with that illness? Because I knew, like, when it comes to dementia with my dad, he's going to be living with dementia for years. A lot of people that get diagnosed with cancer, depending on the type of cancer, they're going to live with it for years because there are such amazing treatments now. And I really wanted to create a resource, kind of go-to place where people can have these conversations with their parents around how they want to live with the illness, where do they want to live, what type of medical treatment they want, what financial plans they may have in place. So that was really the turning point for me, where I said, you know what, I want to use my training and my experience, but I want to use it in a different way.
I mean, it's remarkable what you've created, and really sort of taking a holistic look at sort of the people that are dealing with illness and the families that love those people, and focusing on the living rather than just the dying, right? Obviously, dying is a part of it, but I love what you just said about focusing on living in the midst of it. So, just to educate our viewers and myself, can you just give us a quick sort of description of the difference between palliative care and hospice?
Okay, absolutely. So first of all, there is so much confusion around what palliative care is, what hospice is, and often it just gets lumped together. So palliative care is an extra layer of support for anyone going through any sort of stressful illness.
Okay.
So anything like dementia, cancer, ALS, heart failure. And the idea behind it is that when you have a palliative care member be part of your care team goes from being, let's say, the A team to the A plus team. That's how I like to think of it. And it's really about providing holistic care. And I feel like that's where palliative care really shines, because we think of the person in front of us, that they are so much more than just their illness or just their diagnosis or just their treatments. We recognize that that illness impacts their entire life. It impacts how they interact with their kids, how they interact with their spouse, and how they see themselves.
Yes.
And so that's a huge part of what we do in palliative care. And importantly, and I think this is a distinct factor for palliative care, is that it can be provided at any point in someone's life. So you can get it at any age. You can get it at any stage of illness. So you can ideally, I will say ideally, get it early in the course of dementia, or early in the course of cancer, early in the course of ALS, or you can have it later as well. And it's also available regardless of your prognosis. So what that means is, regardless of whether you're expected to be cured of your illness,
Right.
or if your illness is considered more of a chronic progressive illness, you can get it in both situations.
Right.
So that's how I would think of palliative care. And then hospice care is really kind of holistic care, specifically at the end of life. And so ideally, it's actually in the last months of life, not in the last hours of life, but hopefully in the last months of life, so that you can actually benefit from the services that hospice provides.
That totally makes sense. And, I've never heard it explained that way. I do know from my clients and many of our listeners that there is sort of a reawakening in terms of what palliative care is. And I think that doctors such as yourself sort of championing that sort of care to start much earlier, which is really a beautiful thing, right? It's talking about, to your point, and the goal of your company, which is Epione, to really harness how to live with disease. So, when one is diagnosed with an illness, mom, dad, loved one, what would you say, Ashwini, is the best way for a family member to start a conversation with a loved one about those palliative care issues, whether it's bringing care in or talking about what they see as their future?
I think the first thing before you even sit down to have a conversation with your parent or with your in-law, I would actually sit down with yourself and I would have you think about, what are you hoping to get out of this conversation?
Right.
Are there questions that you need answered? Do you actually want to be clued in a little bit more in terms of what's going on with your parents' health? So I would get super clear about what you're hoping to get out of it and what questions you would ideally like answered. And then I would also say that prepare yourself, because it is an emotional conversation. It is a sensitive conversation, so you don't want to go into it cold. Then the second thing I would do is I would not ambush your parents. This is, a lot of people do this.
Great advice.
Thanksgiving dinner while your mom is carving the turkey, that is not the place to have this conversation. So do not ambush your parents. Give them a heads up, call them on the phone or on WhatsApp and be like, hey, I've really been thinking about you. I was hoping we could just chat about what you're hoping for in the coming years. It can be vague or it can be super specific. You can be like, I'd love to hear what the doctors have told you about blah, blah, blah. Give them a heads up. Let them also prepare themselves. And I would also say, you can have fun with it in the sense of, it doesn't have to be a doom and gloom conversation. You can have this conversation over coffee. You can go for a walk and have this conversation. You can have ice cream afterwards. Maybe you pair it with something both of you enjoy.
Yeah.
But I think that's where I would start. I would start with it being a welcoming, warm conversation. That way your parents have a heads up. They're open to at least having the conversation, and you're ready for the conversation as well. And I think the third thing, if I can add a third thing, is a lot of people, they go into these conversations with an agenda. They'll be like, you know what, I need to know where my mom is going to live because she's getting weaker. She's having trouble going up the stairs. I know that she needs to move into a retirement community, or she needs to move into an ALF assisted living facility. And I would say that that first conversation, it's really more about listening. And so I would actually put your agenda aside and really listen to how your parents are thinking about this. Because the way I see that first conversation, I see it as having it be successful enough that they're open to a second conversation down the road. That's my goal.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a great point. And with that, I think the setting aside of the agenda for many of us in the sandwich generation, it's difficult, right? Because we're trying to advocate for our parent, but yet not overstep. And so, providing that advice of not having an agenda, going in with an open mind, letting them lead the conversation is really amazing. What do you do when the first conversation has happened and you're concerned about them either being in denial because they're not accepting help or treatment, or they're perhaps not communicating? How does your firm and your approach come in to help families sort of deal with these hurdles, whether it's communication or otherwise, within a family structure?
Yeah. So when I think of denial, I don't always see it as a bad thing. I think a lot of people see it as like this terrible thing. I see denial all the time. And denial can be actually very protective in many ways. So for example, when someone gets a new diagnosis or they just fell in their home and they were just in the hospital, denial can potentially give them the space to kind of unconsciously process this new diagnosis, or the fact that they ended up in a situation where they fell at home and then they had someone called 911 and they ended up in the hospital. So denial isn't always the worst coping mechanism. I think the place where denial does not work very well is when it kind of blinds you and prevents you from going there because you are so incredibly scared to see what's there.
Sure.
And so in those situations, I really think of it as, I sometimes even use this image with the caregivers I work with or with their parents. And I say, sometimes it's really scary to open a drawer and look at all the things that could happen in the future. But what we could do is we could take a look, we can pick out one or two things, start making a plan for it, or start talking about it. Or maybe we start talking about why it's so darn hard to talk about it. And then we can close that drawer again. And we don't have to look at it for a little bit. And then maybe at a later time, we open that drawer again and take a look and go back to, why is it so hard for me to think about what would happen if I were to fall again? Right?
That's a great analogy.
And so I find like if you approach it, I think from a place of compassion, I think that usually goes better than. So I just think about that example of a fall. When mom falls and she ends up in the hospital, and as a daughter, I would be convinced, I'm like, she can't stay at home anymore. What if this happens again? Like she definitely needs like companion, she needs 24/7 care, or she needs to go into a supervised like residential setting.
Sure.
If I lead with that, my mom's going to be like, or many moms will be like, you know what? It was just one fall. I'm totally okay. You're making a big deal out of nothing.
Yeah.
And then that's where the conversation stops. But if I took a different approach and I was like, Mom, you know what? I am so glad that you're okay and everything turned out okay. I love you and I really worry about you. Do you think we can brainstorm ways so that we can prevent a fall in the future? And then maybe see what she says.
You're bringing in the loved one as part of, which obviously it's common sense, right? When you lay it out. But I think as adult children, we're hearing from doctors that should be done, and everything that's going on with our peers, we think it should be done. It should be common sense to bring the person into the conversation, but sadly it's not, I guess.
No, and I get it. Like when my dad got diagnosed with dementia, I knew exactly what the next steps were. I made a list. I was like, this is what we're doing. And I was like, you got to see this person and this, and then we got to talk about this. And like, what do you think about this? And when I went through my list, I was like, oh no, I'm losing my dad right here. He's not following any of this. And then I just cut back and I was like, Dad, like, how are you doing with all of this? And he goes, you know what? My grandma had dementia too. And he's like, I've seen it. And I think I know how this is going to go. And I'm okay with it. And I'm like, you're okay with that? I'm not okay with it, But that was really a different response than I think the response I was having. But I needed to kind of rein myself in to even hear him.
So that's amazing. And, you just sort of underscored a point that you made sort of at the top of the episode, which is the timing, right? So your dad was able to express to you early in his diagnosis that he was actually okay with it, that this is something that he had witnessed and he understood the enormity of it. And as a daughter, I can imagine it was probably so comforting to hear that he got it and he knew what was ahead. As sad, I'm sure, as the journey is, we all have people in our lives with memory impairment, and it is a heartbreak every single time. So the timing of bringing the loved one into the conversation as early as possible seems really, really important.
Incredibly important because, when I sat down to have some of these conversations with my dad and with my parents about how he wanted to live with dementia, how he wanted to be cared for, what he thought about like having in-home aid come in sometime in the future or a nursing home, things like that. I wanted him to have a say in it while he was still able to take part in that conversation, because it is a complicated conversation. And so that was incredibly important to me. And to this day, and I will also say that there were certain topics that we could talk about. And then there were other topics like around medical care preferences and end-of-life preferences that he did not feel comfortable sharing with me. At one point, he was like, I just can't talk to you about this because you're my daughter and I don't feel like I can be honest with you. And so that's when I actually pulled in one of my colleagues. She's also a caregiver coach. And I'm like, you know what? They're open to talking with a third party because they want to feel comfortable in sharing how they truly and honestly feel. Would you be open to talking with them? And she did. And thank God they had that conversation about his preferences when it came to medical treatments, his preferences around end-of-life care. And at the end of that coaching session, she actually shared like a document of his wishes. And when I read those wishes, I teared up because I realized I wasn't ready to hear what he truly wanted to say. Because I was in go, go, go mode. I know exactly how this is going to unfold. I know exactly what to prepare for. But I was really shocked to hear some of his responses. And to this day, I'm so grateful that they had that conversation and that he and my parents had this comfortable space where he could share honestly without his daughter, like maybe her face twitching in a weird way or looking sad or whatever. And I'm grateful for that because, the dementia has changed and it has progressed. And at the end of the day, we have this document. It's written. I know what he wants. It's in his own words. And so in the future, if my parents and my brother and I have to make any decisions, we can come back to his own words and what he wanted.
So, I mean, it's so remarkable what you just described, right? Because you are the trained physician that does this for a living. You have the medical training, you have the sociological training, the psychological training. You've done it hundreds, if not thousands of times. And what you realized is as a daughter, you had to step away. Yeah. And I think that's so important for our listeners to hear, where we have Ashwini. She is the expert, guys, And even she had to step away. And so bringing in a third party can sometimes be such a gracious offering to your loved ones so that they can really be honest, right, about those topics that even your, Yale trained palliative care doctor may not be ready to hear. So it's such a universal issue when, we want to be the advocate for our parents. We're now adults. They've raised us to, have independence and agency, but they're still our parents, or they're still our, beloved uncle. And sometimes it's hard to separate.
Yeah. And I think that's 100% true. And I just think about all the things he wouldn't have shared with me that he literally couldn't share with me when it was one-on-one.
Yeah.
That he shared with my friend, a colleague, but that he felt comfortable sharing.
And so bringing in that neutral third party can really sometimes open up the discussion and make sure that you're honoring the choices of your loved one to live, as you point out, as opposed to die, but to live with the illness in the way that they want to live. And you also said something else, Ashwini, that sort of overlaps a bit of my area, and that comes to the documentation, right? So as an estate planning attorney, as an elder care practitioner, those healthcare documents are incredibly important. And thankfully, most states have done a pretty good job at creating documents that can capture and marshal one's wishes about end-of-life care. In New York, we have a document called Healthcare Proxy, and the proxy appoints a person. So, for our listeners, the proxy that you appoint should be someone that you've had a conversation with, perhaps with someone like Ashwini and Ashwini's team, to help your loved one figure out the type of care that you want, so that when they can't speak for themselves, that person, that proxy, can advocate in the healthcare setting. We also have a living will, which I think is more, Ashwini, to what your point was, and the MULST form in New York. And so those documents really are more illustrative, where they go into greater detail about the type of care that you want. So thank you so much for bringing that up, that it's a conversation, and it also can be documented so that no matter what, everyone is quite clear.
Yeah. And I think it's really hard sometimes to look at, let's say, a MOLST form, which kind of looks like a menu of options. And It's really hard to look at that outside of the context of your parents' health and a larger conversation. So I always suggest, if you're looking at the MOLST form and you're so confused about which one is the better option for my parent, I think you have to bring in kind of the medical team and have a larger conversation around what's important to your parents now.
That's I think, is that New York specific, Ashwini?
No, so each state has a unique
their version.
And then some states have something called a POST form or a POST form. So each state has a slightly different version, but the idea is very much the same. It's literally a prescription. It's a medical order. So it's a prescription that says the types of treatments your parent wants or doesn't want. And it's signed off by a physician or a medical provider. And so it's literally a prescription.
Wow. I didn't realize that. I mean, I will say that there are some states that do such a great job. I recently reviewed the state of Vermont's medical directive, and it is wildly comprehensive and really beautifully done. They did a great job in the state of Vermont. It's sort of covering the gamut of what one would want. But so, getting back to the neutral third party and how Epione could come in and help a family, how does your team work with the treatment team? Like, so a client or a patient has, let's say, end stage cancer or cancer that's perhaps not curative, but chronic. And they have a team at Sloan Kettering, and they have a primary care doctor, and then you guys are over here. Can you explain sort of the interplay and how that would work?
Absolutely. So in those cases, we'll either work directly with the family caregiver, so it may be their children that are reaching out to us, or it may be that person themselves, like the person living with cancer that's reaching out to us. And usually they reach out to us because they want to start conversations. Let's say it's the family caregiver. They want to start conversations with their parent around what the parent would want now that they're living answer what's important to them now, what's important to prioritize now. And they may be having a hard time having this conversation with their parents. So that's where they'll usually reach out to us.
Right.
And we'll either, and it kind of depends, we'll either support them in having these conversations with their parent, or we'll bring the parent on the Zoom call and kind of mediate that conversation. Or sometimes, similar to me, they'll be like, you know what, can you just talk to my parents? And then they can share what they need to share. And then the document that we call it a caregiver action plan. And in that caregiver action plan, we outline the values that are important to their parent, what their preferences are, what the simple things like what brings them joy now, what are things they want to keep doing now. That way they can share it with their kids, and that in the future, if needed, their kids can look at that document and be like, would my dad have wanted this treatment? I don't know. Let me look at what it says. And what that document says are, these are the things my dad enjoys doing. He likes going for walks. He likes gardening. Is this treatment going to get him closer to keeping doing that? And if it's not, is that the best treatment for him? And if it's not, but that's the only treatment, right? Like, then it's like, okay, how can we keep incorporating the things he loves regardless of where his life takes him?
So it's sort of the touchstone, would you say, of the treatment, right? So you can always go back and reference it and constantly reorient, and maybe even like update the form with your parent if they still have the capacity to do it.
Absolutely. Because their wishes are going to change over time. What they want when they're 50 years old is going to be totally different than what they want when they're in their 80s, right? And so, and the whole idea behind that document is it is in your parents' words, and you can bring that to the medical team. So I know you were asking, how do we coordinate that? So oftentimes with the permission of the family caregiver or the person living with the illness themselves, we'll reach out to their primary care doctor or their cancer doctor, and we'll just get on the phone and be like, hey, we saw this person. We wanted to make sure you were aware of what their wishes are. This is what their wishes are. This is what's really important to them as you consider this other treatment. We'll send them the caregiver action plan so that they have it. And oftentimes that caregiver action plan, people literally will print it out and bring it to their next doctor's appointment to be like, I know we're making this decision about whether I should take treatment A or treatment B, but this is what's really important to my dad. Like, which one of these treatments do you think is going to get us closer to it? Or are there other options that could bring us closer to it? Or do we need to try out the treatment and then reassess how he's doing and how he's feeling?
So you know, just in the context of treatment, I mean, I think what a great way for a family to be able to communicate to the physician, right? Because I mean, it's hard to know the right questions to ask. I'm sure the doctors have all the answers and they can say, well, yeah, that's not going to really work well if your dad, you know, wants to do X, Y, or Z, or has a family wedding in France and you need to go. We have to make sure that that doesn't start then. So really remarkable way to approach it.
Yeah, I just think about this family caregiver I worked with recently, and they were thinking of going on a clinical trial. One of the things, this clinical trial was going to be pretty intensive for a solid year, and they were going to go to the big academic center about once every 2 weeks, and that big academic center is about a 2-hour drive from where they live. Now, what was really important to this person was that they love spending 6 months outside the U.S. in Europe, because that's where they grew up. They spend winter outside the U.S. and they spend summers in the U.S. and they have family outside the U.S. So that was really important. When we looked at what that clinical trial entailed, if they were to enroll in it, they wouldn't be able to leave the U.S. because they would need to be within a 2-hour radius of that academic center. So even though the treatment itself really didn't have significant side effects, it was all the appointments, the visits, the lab draws that were going to tie this person to a 2-hour radius of that academic center. And this summer, they wouldn't be able to be in Europe. the way they usually would spend it. And so using what was important to him to figure out, is this clinical trial, does it make sense for you? Even though technically the treatment, there weren't significant side effects to it.
I mean, that story and anecdote in and of itself sums up exactly why it's so important to have these really meaningful conversations, because the clinical answer, the medical answer from a doctor may not be the right answer for the individual. And, in terms of caring for your loved one and making sure that they have their needs met, as sandwich generation listeners, where we're sort of the ones hopefully advocating and making sure that all of our loved ones' needs are met, what is your suggestion for those sandwich generation members to make sure that they're okay?
Yeah, I would definitely have 2 suggestions, and I think it's going to resonate with a lot of people. I would say have the courage to have the talk.
Yeah.
It's never too late. Even if, let's say, your parent can't communicate, this is where pulling in a caregiver coach to help figure out the framework of values important to your parent is going to just simplify your life. It's going to help you have fewer regrets when you're trying to decide, does mom stay at home or does she go into an ALF? Like, you can use that framework to make any sort of decision. And if your parent is able to take part in that conversation, it can really help you clarify your own role and the responsibilities they are kind of hoping you will take on. And you can negotiate those responsibilities. If you know what their expectations are for you, you can negotiate. You can maneuver a little bit.
Yeah.
And so for a lot of parents, when they think about getting older and where they're going to live if they can't live at home by themselves, a lot of them will say, well, it's okay. I'm going to move in with my daughter. She lives just 10 minutes down the street. Well, daughter does not know that. She's your own all, So wouldn't you want to know that? So you can plan for it too. And then you can figure out what role you have in all of this. So I would say that's definitely a piece of advice. And the second piece of advice is caregiving is supposed to be a shared responsibility. So it should not be on just one person. It should not. It's too much. It is too much for just one person. So sometimes you end up being the caregiver because you're the most organized one in the family. You're the most, quote, successful one. You have your stuff together, and that's why you end up being the caregiver. But this is really a time to start asking for help. And I think we suck at it. I think we really do. But this is the time to ask for help, because if you have siblings, they probably want to help. But maybe they feel like, oh, you've got everything. Why even bother asking? Or maybe your friends want to help too. They just don't know how to, and they don't want to feel stupid. They don't want to feel like, oh, I don't want to make a suggestion because, it's a problem.
Maybe it's not the right one.
Right.
Yeah.
And no, I would say definitely start, and it's incredibly hard. I would say share the load and start delegating. And look, maybe they won't do it perfectly. Maybe they won't put the medications out perfectly for your mom. But if they do it well enough that your mom takes it and you get to go out for a walk for 30 minutes, well, then that's worth it.
I mean, so that's a really great point too, right? It's not only about the asking, it's about the accepting of the help and giving up the control a little bit, that it might not be done exactly the way that you would have done it. And so, that leads me sort of to one of my almost last questions is, what do you do with a family that prior to this diagnosis, prior to these issues, there are big issues, that there are difficult intra-family relationships, either parent to child, sibling? What is your best advice for those complicated family relationships when then also dealing with this?
Yeah, I would definitely say that when you have a complicated relationship with your parent or with your siblings, I will go back to it. Having that talk with your parents early on is going to make a huge difference, because later on down the road, when you're trying to figure out if mom stays at home or if mom goes into the memory care unit, it won't be what I think we should do for mom versus what my brother thinks we should do for mom, which will probably not be the same thing. It'll be, this is what mom would have wanted. How can we help her get that? So those early conversations help to ease some of that infighting, and it helps you kind of get everyone at least on the same page of what mom would have wanted. I would also say have pretty realistic expectations of yourself, because, and there's nothing like an illness that brings out the stress and fractures of a family.
Yes.
So if you were expecting, if you and your brother have never agreed on anything before and you constantly fight, you're probably going to fight over what is best for mom. Unless you have that early conversation, you're probably going to fight over it. And so I would not expect those family fractures and fighting to miraculously get better under the stress of an illness.
And so, just because you won't do it yourself, but I will champion, your organization, that this is a perfect opportunity for the neutral third party to come in and in some ways maybe act as a mediator so that both sides are heard and that everyone is refocusing on mom or dad or the loved one. So, shout out to Ashwini and I'm sure your unbelievable diplomacy skills that are required in some family circumstances. I mean, somebody said that to me recently, that, you're just never your best self when you're faced with losing a loved one or you're, in that position on your own, having received a troubling diagnosis. But the last question I'm going to ask for you, Ashwini, is that, you've had this, amazing career that you've created for yourself. You've worn the hat of the palliative care physician. You've instructed physicians coming up and hopefully filling the field of palliative care with much needed resources. And you've also been the daughter.
Yeah.
So what is your best advice as the daughter, or something that you wish you would have done differently now in retrospect?
I think I wish I had listened. So it's interesting because when my dad got his diagnosis, I went into action mode.
Yeah.
I went into check boxes, to-do lists. I got to reach out to this colleague and that colleague. I wish I had just been like much early on before I went a little crazy. I wish I had just asked my dad, like, hey, how are you doing?
Yeah.
And to be honest, I wish before he even had the formal diagnosis, I wish I had asked him, do you want a formal workup? Do you want to know what this could be?
Yeah.
I didn't. I wish I had, because he has told me, like in passing a couple of times, that he may not have gone for the formal diagnosis and everything if my family hadn't kind of pushed it. And it's interesting because my other family member mentioned in passing as well that when the day he got that diagnosis, it was as something changed. And all of a sudden, he felt like he couldn't do anything. He went from being super independent in terms of like going from our house to the park and going for a walk by himself to all of a sudden he was like, I don't know if I can go for a walk by myself. Maybe you need to come with me.
Right.
So I wish, I wish I had had that conversation much earlier, like even before the diagnosis, if he wanted to know, like, did he actually want a workup? Because now in retrospect, I'm like, maybe he just did that because we kind of pushed it.
So really the sort of moral of the story in all of this is really go back to your loved one and be present with them and ask and not make assumptions. So, I mean, your cautionary tale and all of the great information that you provided is just really amazing for our listeners, for me. I'm just so grateful for your time today, Ashwini, and for what you're doing and hopefully changing the trajectory of aging and having those great conversations. So I can't thank you enough. We're going to put all of your contact information in the notes in the show. And so thank you for joining us, Ashwini.
No, thank you so much for having me. And honestly, if I can change the trajectory in a positive way for one other person and one other family, that to me is so worth it. So thank you so much for having me here and even taking part in this conversation.
Absolutely.